Hey guys, it's Bang from About PC Gaming here. Just making an updated video in terms of Vega news. Now, as of yesterday, Ryan Shrout from PC Perspective got his Vega Frontier Edition GPU through the post, and he did share quite a few results with us with a live benchmarking session which he did, and he shared the results on YouTube as well, so you can actually see this video live if you wish to watch the whole video. But I'm just gonna share with you some of the results. Now, these results were basically photographed from a monitor, from a YouTube feed, so the quality is pretty terrible, but I've done my best to clean these up as best as I can. So before I go into anything, yes, we do need to kind of confirm some things. So the AMD Vega Frontier Edition is marketed as a workstation slash gaming card, basically essentially what the Titan X is. Now, we all know the Titan X is very handy when it comes to gaming, but it's not marketed as a gaming card, which is why it has a ridiculous price of $1,200. Now, what the Frontier Edition is pretty much AMD's first crack at making themselves a prosumer card as well. Something that's going to be good at professional applications, and also be able to play games as well. So this is Ryan Shrout's thinking of it, and he made sure he got the best drivers to do the test, which was confirmed by AMD themselves that these are the latest drivers. The test bed he used an Intel i7-5960X. He had an Asus X99 motherboard, 16GB of DDR4, and a Corsair AX 1500 power supply, which is obviously way overkill, so no issues there for power delivery. Now, the card that was tested also had HBCC enabled, which is high bandwidth cache controller, and this card is going to be running stock with no modifications at all to fan curve or power limit. So it's basically just an out of the box run test benchmark. Also, AMD did confirm that gaming mode and pro mode at this time does not really have any changes to gaming performance, so he just ran it at pro mode, I believe. So everything, these are all basically the conditions of the test. So for those of you that don't know the specs of the RX Vega Frontier Edition that was used, I'll just let you know it's powered by the Vega architecture, 25 teraflops of peak FP16 compute performance, 13 teraflops of peak FP32 compute performance, 16GB of high bandwidth cache, and basically HBM2 memory, 64 next gen compute units, and 4096 stream processors. So those are the specs out of the way. Now, he did end up testing 6 games, and I'll start off with Dirt Rally. All games are at 4K. If you want to get all the individual settings and stuff like that, you'll have to look at his article once he publishes that. So for Dirt Rally 4K, we've got the GTX 1080 Ti, 1080, and the Vega Frontier Edition data. The Vega Frontier Edition is the kind of turquoisey blue graph point, so you'd have to look at that if you want to see where Vega is performing. So as you can see in Dirt Rally, the founders of the Frontier Edition, was getting around, say, between 55 and 45 frames per second. Pretty much on par with the GTX 1080, but losing out by around about 4 to 5%. Obviously, the GTX 1080 Ti averaging around 80 to 83 frames per second, so in a league of its own essentially. So let's move on. Again, I do apologize for the pictures, but again, they were kind of basically photographed off a monitor from a YouTube feed, so they're not great. Fallout 4 is the next game, again at 4K. GTX 1080 Ti doing around, it's quite an erratic test. I mean, you start off at 100 frames per second, it drops down to around 54, and then jumps back up to 85, and then, you know, it kind of levels itself out at around 65 frames per second, we'll call it. Looking at the AMD Frontier Edition Vega, starts off around 60, drops down to around about 43, picks back up a bit to about around 50 frames per second, and then kind of levels out around 40 to 43 frames per second. Again, losing out to the GTX 1080 for around about 5%, give or take some points it does overlap in with having higher minimum frames. So that's an interesting test. Let's move on to GTA 5. Now let's start off with the AMD Vega Frontier edition. This was able to kind of start the test at around 25 frames per second, and then jumps up to around 30, boosts up to about 43 as a maximum, but kind of levels out around 32 to 33 frames per second, which isn't great. As you can see, the GTX 1080 had quite a larger margin this time over the Vega Frontier edition, getting around 40 frames per second and averaging around 45 frames per second at 4K. As you can see, the GTX 1080 Ti, again in a league of its own, pretty much averaging in the high 50s to 60 frames per second range. So that's that. Moving on now to Hitman, and this is the newest one, the DirectX 12 game, and yeah, Vega pretty much averaging around 50 to 52 frames per second with lows of 45. So not too bad at 4K. GTX 1080 though outperforming again by around 7, this time around 7 to 8% I would say, because it's almost maintaining a constant 60, dropping down to around the lows of 55 frames per second, then been picking up again, even exceeding 60 frames per second in some places. So this is one of the games I expected, obviously the Frontier edition, to do a better job than 1080, but that wasn't the case. GTX 1080 Ti in a league of its own again, easily achieving 70 frames per second and over, and holding. So let's move on. So Rise of the Tomb Raider, more optimized for Nvidia, so you know, you can expect Nvidia to perform better in this game. But for the Frontier edition, able to kind of achieve an average of 35 frames per second, dipping down to around 29 to 28 as a minimum. But on an average, I would say that it would probably have a 36 to 35 frames per second as an average. GTX 1080 averaging around, let's just say for the most part, 42 to 43 frames per second, then dipping down to 35 and above when it comes to obviously the more demanding parts of the benchmark. The GTX 1080 Ti again way above these two at 4K, DirectX 12. We're saying an average of around 60 to 50 and minimums of like, let's just say 48 frames per second. In our more demanding parts averaging around 50, but for the most part you will get around 55 to 60 frames per second. So I think we have one more game now, which is The Witcher 3. Hailworks was disabled, just to make you aware, so the game was pretty much you know, as fair as it possibly could be for the AMD hardware. The Frontier edition, let's start with that. 40 frames per second and pretty much holding, and this benchmark was taken in Novigrad, and one of the most demanding towns, some of the most demanding areas in the game, so it's a good place to test the system. For the most part averaging around 40 to 42 frames per second, and then, you know, dipping down to around 33 frames, then back up to around 42 to 43. GTX 1080, you know, just a bit higher than that, around about 44 frames per second, and then it only dips down here because there's a cutscene, and then it jumps back into the gameplay again. So GTX 1080 jumping back up to around 45 frames per second as an average, I would say. GTX 1080 Ti holding above 60 pretty much all the time, so definitely giving you the best performance. So that's just a look at some of the benchmarks from the AMD Vega Frontier edition. Now I know some of you guys are not going to be happy with me sharing these results for some reason, but the fact is this is still the silicone that's going to be used in the RX Vega, what's going to be coming out at the end of July. So essentially this is going to be the same card, just with more optimized drivers. Yes, I'm pretty sure AMD will have to probably squeeze a few more percent of performance out of it, maybe 8 to 10% in my opinion, but don't expect anything too drastic. You guys really need to manage your expectations when it comes to Vega at this point in time. It's not looking great in terms of what we expected. I think we all kind of expected a card that will beat the 1080 100% sure, and kind of be between the 1080 Ti, if not beat it. But this definitely isn't the case at this point in time. Where we'll be from a year from now, who knows? But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the current affairs. And you got to remember as well, if you have a look at the Quadro equivalent of the Titan XP, the full fat silicon Titan XP, even with non-gaming drivers, that completely destroys the GTX 1080 and the normal Titan, the Titan XP that came before the Titan little XP. So the card should still be performing regardless of the drivers to a certain extent. So don't expect any miracles from the final RX Vega. That's all I'm trying to explain to you guys. That's pretty much it for me. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.